George Strait loses childhood friend in Texas flood. His reaction moved the world. The water came without warning, like a beast awakening from decades of slumber. Mike Wilkins pressed his weathered hands against the kitchen window, watching. In horror as Cypress Creek, normally a gentle ribbon of water meandering through Bandera, Texas, transformed into a roaring monster. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, but nothing had prepared the 67-year-old carpenter for what he was witnessing now. "Dear God," he whispered, his breath fogging the glass. The water was already lapping at the foundation of his neighbor's house across the street. Mrs. Henderson, 83 years old and stubborn as a Texas mule, had refused to leave when the first evacuation warnings came through the radio. Mike had tried to convince her yesterday, but she'd waved him off with her usual dismissive gesture. "I've lived through worse," she'd said, though Mike couldn't imagine what could be worse than this. The creek had risen 8 feet in just 2 hours. Mike had seen floods before, but nothing like this. The water moved with a violence that made his stomach churn, carrying with it debris that told the story of other homes, other lives already torn apart. A child's bicycle, still bright red despite the mud, tumbled past his window. A wooden fence. A post followed, then what looked like someone's front door, painted blue and still hanging on its hinges. Mike's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He knew who it was before looking at the screen. His daughter Sarah, calling from Dallas, probably, watching the news coverage of the floods. But Mike couldn't talk right now, not when Mrs. Henderson was still in that house, and not when the water was rising faster than anything he'd ever seen in his 77 years of life in this small Texas town. He thought about his old friend George Strait, probably performing somewhere far from here, surrounded by thousands of fans who loved him for the music he'd helped create right here in Bandera County. If you're watching this story unfold from wherever you are in the world, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories that touch the heart and remind us what truly matters in life. George and Mike had grown up together on these same roads, fishing in this same creek when it was nothing more than a peaceful stream where they'd skip rocks and talk about their dreams. George had always been the one with the voice, the one who could make a room full of people stop talking just by humming a melody. Mike had been the one with the tools, the one who could fix anything with his hands, and had never wanted to leave Bandera, even when George's career took him to Nashville and beyond. They'd remained friends through all the years, through George's rise to fame and his countless albums. George would come back to Bandera whenever he could, always making time to sit on Mike's porch and share a beer, talking about the old days, when the biggest worry was whether the bass were biting down at the river bend. Mike had never been jealous of George's success. If anything, he'd been proud, always telling anyone who'd listen that he'd grown up with the king of country music. But now, watching the water surge toward Mrs. Henderson's house, Mike felt more alone than he'd ever felt in his life. The phone rang again. This time, it was the emergency services, their automated voice telling him to evacuate immediately. Mike looked at his own house, the home he'd built with his own hands 40 years ago, where he'd raised his children and buried his wife. The water hadn't reached his foundation yet, but it was coming. He could feel it in the way the ground seemed to vibrate beneath his feet. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson's front door opened. Mike could see her silhouette in the doorway, probably just now realizing the severity of the situation. The water was already up to her porch steps, and Mike knew she wouldn't be able to wade through it alone. She was too frail, too unsteady on her feet. Without thinking, Mike grabbed his keys and headed for his truck. The water was ankle-deep in his driveway, but the old Ford was high enough to make it across the street. He'd done stupider things in his life, and he sure as hell wasn't going to let his neighbor drown while he watched from his kitchen window. The truck started on the first try, thank God. Mike backed out of his driveway and immediately felt the current pushing against the vehicle. The water was stronger than it looked, and deeper too. By the time he reached the middle of the street, it was up to his door handles. The engine coughed once, then caught again. Mrs. Henderson was standing on her porch now, clutching a small suitcase and looking more frightened than Mike had ever seen her. The water was already flowing across her porch, and her front steps had completely disappeared beneath the brown, swirling torrent. "Martha!" Mike called out, rolling down his window. "Get in the truck, we need to go now!" She looked at him with eyes wide with terror, then back at her house. Mike understood the hesitation. This was her home, the place where she'd lived for 50 years, where she'd raised her own family. Leaving meant admitting it might all be gone when she came back. "Martha, please," Mike called again, his voice barely audible over the roar of the water. "We don't have time." She nodded finally and started moving toward the truck, but the water was too deep, too fast. Mike watched in horror as she stepped off the porch and immediately lost her footing. The current grabbed her like a rag doll, pulling her under the muddy water. Mike didn't think. He threw the truck into park and jumped out, immediately feeling the shocking cold of the flood water and the incredible force of the current. The water was up to his chest, and he could barely keep his footing on the submerged pavement. He could see Martha's grey hair breaking the surface about 20 feet downstream, her arms flailing as she tried to stay afloat. The current was stronger than Mike had anticipated. Within seconds, he was struggling to keep his own head above water. The debris in the flood was dangerous, chunks of wood and metal that could knock a person unconscious. Mike had always been a strong swimmer, but this wasn't swimming. This was survival. He managed to grab hold of a partially submerged fence and post and pulled himself toward where he'd last seen Martha. The water was moving too fast, carrying everything in its path toward the river. Mike knew that once the flood reached the Guadalupe River, anything caught in it would be swept away for miles. "Martha!" he called out, spitting mud and water. He could see her about 30 feet ahead, clinging to what looked like a tree branch. She was still alive, but Mike could see she was weakening. The cold water and the shock were taking their toll on her elderly body. Mike let go of the fence post and allowed the current to carry him downstream, trying to angle himself toward Martha. It was the most terrifying thing he'd ever done, giving up his anchor and trusting the flood to take him where he needed to. Go! The water was filled with debris, and Mike felt something sharp scrape against his leg, probably a piece of broken glass or metal roofing. He was getting closer to Martha, but the current was also getting stronger. They were approaching the bend in the creek, where it joined the larger river system. If they got swept into the main channel, Mike knew they'd never make it out alive. With a final burst of strength, Mike managed to grab Martha's arm. She was barely conscious, her lips blue with cold and her eyes unfocused. Mike wrapped his arm around her waist and looked desperately for something to hold on to. The water was carrying them faster now, and Mike could hear the roar of the river ahead. That's when he saw it. A large oak tree, one of the old giants that had stood in Bandera for over a century. The flood hadn't been able to uproot it, and its massive trunk was creating a small eddy in the current. If Mike could get them to that tree, they might have a chance. Using every ounce of strength he had left, Mike kicked toward the oak tree, fighting against the current that wanted to carry them to the river. Martha was dead weight in his arms, but Mike refused to let go. He thought about George, about their childhood adventures, about all the times they'd promised to look out for each other. He thought about his late wife, about his daughter Sarah, about all the reasons he had to survive this nightmare. His fingertips touched the rough bark of the oak tree, and Mike managed to wrap his free arm around a low branch. The relief was overwhelming, but Mike knew they weren't safe yet. The water was still rising, and he could feel Martha's body going limp in his arms. She needed medical attention, and they needed to get to higher ground. Mike looked around desperately, trying to find a way to get them both to safety. The tree was about 50 yards from the nearest high ground, but the current between them and safety was too strong. Mike realized with growing horror that he might have to make an impossible choice. That's when he heard the sound of a helicopter overhead, its rotors barely audible over the roar of the flood. Mike looked up and saw the emergency services helicopter circling above them, but he knew they couldn't land in these conditions. The pilot was probably radioing for a rescue boat, but Mike didn't know if they had that kind of time. Martha stirred in his arms, coughing up muddy water. Her eyes focused on Mike's face, and she managed to whisper, "Thank you." Mike felt his heart breaking, knowing that he might not be able to save her, knowing that his decision to try to help might have doomed them both. The helicopter circled again, lower this time, and Mike could see someone in the open door with a megaphone, but the words were lost in the noise of the flood and the aircraft. Mike held onto Martha and the tree branch, feeling his strength ebbing away, wondering if George would ever know what happened to his old friend, wondering if this was how his story would end. The water continued to rise, and Mike felt the current tugging at his legs with renewed force. Something had changed upstream. Maybe a dam had failed, or another tributary had joined the flood. Whatever it was, Mike knew they were running out of time. But Mike Wilkins had never been a quitter, and he wasn't about to start now. Not with Martha's life depending on him, not with so much left undone in his own life. He adjusted his grip on the tree branch and whispered a prayer. The same prayer his grandmother had taught him as a child, the same prayer that had gotten him through every difficult moment in his 77 years. What happened next would change everything, not just for Mike and Martha, but for their entire community and for a country music legend who was about to learn that fame and fortune mean nothing when the people you love are fighting for their lives. The rescue boat appeared around the bend like an answer to prayer, its motor straining against the current as two emergency workers fought to navigate through the debris-filled water. Mike had never been so happy to see strangers in his entire life. The boat was small, barely large enough for 4 people, but it was their only chance. "Hold on!" shouted one of the rescuers, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25. "We're coming to get you." Mike felt Martha's grip tighten around his arm. She was conscious but barely responsive, her body shaking uncontrollably from the cold water and shock. The rescuers managed to maneuver their boat close enough to the oak tree for Mike to pass Martha across. It took 3 attempts, with the current constantly pushing the boat away from the tree, but finally they got her safely aboard. "Your turn!" the rescuer called out, but Mike was having trouble letting go of the branch. His hands had been gripping the rough bark for so long that his fingers had cramped into claws. The cold water had sapped his strength, and he could barely feel his legs anymore. With the help of both rescuers, Mike was finally pulled into the boat. As they powered away from the oak tree, he watched his neighborhood disappear beneath the muddy water. Houses he'd known for decades were now just rooftops poking above the surface. The little grocery store where he'd bought his morning coffee for 20 years was completely submerged. "Where are we taking them?" asked the younger rescuer, whose name tag read Tommy Jenkins. "Emergency shelter at the high school," replied the older man, Captain Rodriguez, according to his uniform. "It's about the only building in town that's still above water." Mike looked back one more time at what had been his world. His own house was gone, swallowed by the flood. 40 years of memories, photographs, the rocking chair where his wife had nursed their babies, the kitchen table where they'd shared countless meals and conversations. All of it was underwater now, probably being carried toward the Guadalupe River along with everything else that had made Bandera home. At the high school, the gymnasium had been transformed into a massive refugee camp. Families huddled on Red Cross cots, their faces bearing the same expression of shock and loss that Mike felt in his own heart. Children cried while their parents tried to comfort them, though the adults looked just as scared and confused as their kids. A volunteer nurse checked Martha's vital signs and declared her stable but suffering from hypothermia and shock. They wrapped her in warm blankets and started an IV to help with dehydration. Mike sat beside her cot, still dripping wet and shivering, refusing treatment until he knew she was going to be okay. "You saved her life," the nurse told him. "If you hadn't gotten her to that tree, she would have drowned for sure." Mike nodded, but he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who'd lost everything and barely managed to save one person in the process. Around the gymnasium, he could see dozens of other families dealing with their own losses, their own grief. That's when he heard his name being called. "Mike! Mike Wilkins!" He turned to see Reverend Jackson, the pastor from the Baptist church, making his way through the crowd of displaced families. The Reverend's church had been on higher ground and had escaped the worst of the flooding, but his congregation was scattered throughout the emergency shelters. "Mike, thank God you're alive," Reverend Jackson said, embracing him. "We've been trying to account for everyone. Your daughter Sarah has been calling the emergency hotline every hour asking about you." "My phone's gone," Mike said, gesturing to his soaked clothes. "Everything's gone." "We'll get you to a phone," the Reverend promised. "But first, let's get you some dry clothes and a hot meal. You look like you've been through hell." Mike accepted the offer gratefully, though he insisted on staying close to Martha until she was fully conscious and coherent. It wasn't until late that evening that he finally called Sarah from the Red Cross station they'd set up in the high school library. "Daddy!" Sarah's voice was thick with tears. "I've been so worried. The news is showing terrible pictures, and when I couldn't reach you." "I'm okay, sweetheart," Mike said, though the words felt strange coming out of his mouth. Was he okay? He was alive, but everything else was gone. "The house is gone, but I'm safe." "Daddy, I'm driving down there right now. I should be there by morning." "No, Sarah, the roads are washed out. You can't get into town. Wait until they say it's safe." But Mike knew his daughter well enough to know she wouldn't listen. Sarah had inherited her father's stubborn streak, and she'd find a way to get to Bandera, even if she had to walk the last 50 miles. 3 days later, the water had receded enough for rescue teams to begin the grim task of searching for victims. Mike volunteered to help, knowing the town better than most of the outside rescue workers. What they found was devastating. Entire neighborhoods had been scoured clean, leaving only bare ground and scattered debris. They found Mike's truck wrapped around a telephone pole 2 miles downstream from where he'd abandoned it. The oak tree that had saved his and Martha's lives was still standing, but it was now decorated with a grotesque collection of debris. Pieces of houses, furniture, children's toys, and personal belongings from dozens of families. The death toll climbed slowly as bodies were recovered. 12 people confirmed dead, including the Jenkins family from Maple Street and old Mr. Peterson, who'd refused to leave his farm. Dozens more were still missing, and Mike feared the worst for many of them. It was on the 4th day after the flood that Mike's story took a turn that would change everything. A reporter from San Antonio had come to cover the disaster, and she'd heard about Mike's rescue of Martha Henderson. She wanted to interview him about his heroic actions during the flood. "I'm not a hero," Mike insisted, but the reporter, a young woman named Jessica Torres, was persistent. "Mr. Wilkins, you risked your life to save your neighbor. That's the definition of heroism." "I did what anyone would do," Mike replied, but Jessica had already started her camera rolling. "Tell me about your connection to George Strait," she said suddenly, catching Mike off guard. "What does George have to do with anything?" Mike asked. Confused. "My research shows that you two grew up together here in Bandera. You were childhood friends, is that correct?" Mike nodded slowly. "We were friends. Still are, I suppose, though I haven't seen him in a while." "When was the last time you spoke to him?" Mike thought about it. "Maybe 6 months ago. He called to check on me after my doctor told him about my heart troubles. George always was good about keeping in touch. Do you think he knows about the flood? About what happened here? Mike shrugged. I imagine he's heard about it. It's been on the news. But George is a busy man. He's got his own life to worry about. But even as Mike said the words, he wondered if George really did know. His friend had always been loyal, always remembered where he came from. If George knew that Bandera had been devastated, if he knew that Mike had lost everything, would he come home? That evening, Jessica Torres' story aired on the San Antonio News. It was a powerful piece about the forgotten victims of the flood, focusing on Mike's heroic rescue of Martha Henderson and the broader story of a community struggling to rebuild. She'd interviewed several other survivors, including a family who'd lost their home, but managed to save their grandfather's violin, the only thing connecting them to their family's history. But it was Mike's story that captured viewers' attention. Here was a man who'd lost everything but had risked his life to save a neighbor. Here was a man who'd grown up with one of country music's biggest stars but had chosen to stay in his small hometown, living a quiet life as a carpenter until disaster struck. The story went viral on social media within hours. Nashka Bandera Strong began trending on Twitter, and the story was picked up by national news outlets. Suddenly, Mike Wilkins wasn't just a flood victim. He was a symbol of the resilience and generosity, of spirit that defined rural America. But Mike wasn't thinking about social media or national attention. He was thinking about the long road ahead, about rebuilding his life at 67 years old, about the friends and neighbors who hadn't made it through the flood. He was thinking about Martha Henderson, who was finally well enough to go stay with her daughter in Austin, and about all the families who were still living in the gymnasium, waiting for word about insurance claims and government assistance. Most of all, he was thinking about George, wondering if his old friend had seen the news, wondering if George remembered the promise they'd made to each other as boys, that no matter how far apart life took them, they'd always be there for each other when it mattered most. What Mike didn't know was that at that very moment, in a hotel room in Denver, Colorado, George Strait was staring at his phone screen, watching Jessica Torres' news report for the third time, his heart breaking as he saw the devastation in his hometown and realized that his dearest friend had nearly died while he'd been performing for crowds of strangers, completely unaware that the place that had shaped him, the people who'd known him before the fame, were fighting for their very survival. George's hands were shaking as he set down his phone. The king of country music, the man who'd sold over 100 million records, the performer who'd maintained his composure through thousands of shows and countless interviews, felt like he was falling apart. On the screen, he'd watched Mike Wilkins, his childhood friend, talking about losing everything in the flood. Mike looked older than George remembered, more fragile, and the pain in his eyes was something George had never seen before. How did I not know? George whispered to himself in the empty hotel room. How did I not know about this? He'd been so focused on his tour, so wrapped up in the bubble of fame that surrounded him everywhere he went, that he'd missed the biggest disaster to hit his home region in decades. While Bandera was drowning, he'd been performing in Kansas City, then Chicago, then Milwaukee, moving from one arena to the next like it was just another series of shows. George called his manager, Tom Bradley, who answered on the first ring despite the late hour. "George, what's wrong? You sound upset." "Tom, I need you to cancel the rest of the tour, starting tonight." There was a long pause. "George, what are you talking about?" "We have 3 sold-out shows this weekend. The venues are expecting you. The fans have bought tickets." "I said cancel them, all of them. I'm going home." "Home?" "George, you can't just cancel shows. Do you have any idea what this will cost? The penalties alone will be—" "Tom, my hometown just got destroyed by a flood. My best friend nearly died. I've been driving around the country playing music while The people who made me who I am were fighting for their lives. I don't care about the money." Tom Bradley had been George's manager for 15 years, and he'd never heard this tone in his client's voice. George Strait was known for his professionalism, his reliability, his commitment to his fans. For him to even consider cancelling a show was unprecedented. "George, I understand you're upset, but we can work something out. Maybe we can organize a benefit concert later, donate some proceeds to the relief efforts. But cancelling shows at this point will damage your reputation. People are counting on you." "The only people I care about counting on me are drowning in Texas," George replied, his voice growing firm. "Cancel the shows, Tom. I'm not asking you, I'm telling you." After hanging up, George sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the dark Denver skyline outside his hotel window. He thought about all the times he'd driven through Bandera on his way to and from Nashville in the early days of his career. He thought about the creek where he and Mike had spent countless summer afternoons, the same creek that had nearly killed his friend. Most of all, he thought about the last conversation he'd had with Mike 6 months earlier. Mike had called to tell him about some heart problems he'd been having, and George had promised to visit soon. But soon had turned into months, and months had turned into a flood that had washed away everything Mike had worked for his entire life. George packed his bags and was on a plane to San Antonio by 6 in the morning. He didn't tell anyone he was coming, didn't call ahead to arrange security or media management. He just wanted to get home, to see for himself what had happened to the place that had made him. The drive from San Antonio to Bandera normally took an hour and a half, but the roads were still damaged from the flooding. George had to take several detours, and what he saw along the way prepared him for the worst. Entire sections of highway had been washed away. Trees that had stood for decades were gone. Small towns that he'd driven through hundreds of times were now collections of debris and empty foundations. When he finally reached Bandera, George pulled his truck over to the side of the road and just sat there, staring at what remained of his hometown. The main street where he'd walked as a boy was now a river of mud and scattered debris. The diner where he'd shared his first song with Mike was gone, completely swept away. The old movie theater where they'd spent Saturday afternoons as teenagers was a pile of twisted metal and concrete blocks. George had seen natural disasters on television before, had even participated in benefit concerts for hurricane victims and earthquake survivors. But this was different. This was personal. This was the place where George Strait had learned to sing, where he'd written his first songs, where he'd fallen in love with music and with the idea that maybe, just maybe, he could make something of himself. He drove slowly through the town, or what was left of it. The high school where he'd played football was still standing, and he could see the Red Cross vehicles parked outside. That's where the survivors were staying, he realized. That's where Mike was. George parked his truck and walked toward the school, but before he could reach the entrance, he was recognized by a volunteer who was unloading supplies from a truck. "Oh my God, you're George Strait," the woman said, nearly dropping the box she was carrying. "What are you doing here?" "I'm from here," George replied simply. "I'm looking for Mike Wilkins." Word spread quickly through the volunteer network that George Strait was at the school. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered, but George barely noticed. His attention was focused on finding Mike, on seeing for himself that his friend was okay. Reverend Jackson appeared at George's side, and George was relieved to see a familiar face. "George, I can't believe you're here," the Reverend said, shaking his hand. "Mike is going to be so happy to see you. Is he okay? I saw the news report, but I need to see him myself." "He's fine, physically. Emotionally, well, he's been through hell. We all have." The Reverend led George through the gymnasium, which had been transformed into a refugee camp. Families were living in spaces marked off by Red Cross blankets, their entire lives reduced to whatever they'd managed to save from the flood. Children played quietly between the cots while their parents stared at phones, trying to navigate insurance, claims, and government assistance applications. George saw Mike before Mike saw him. His friend was sitting beside an elderly woman's cot, reading to her from a water-damaged book. Mike looked tired, older than his 67 years, and George could see the weight of everything he'd been through in the way his shoulders sagged. "Mike," George called out softly. Mike looked up, and for a moment his face showed complete confusion. Then recognition dawned, followed by an expression of joy and relief that nearly broke George's heart. "George?" Mike stood up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. "George, what are you doing here? Don't you have shows to play?" "I cancelled them," George said, embracing his friend. "I'm sorry, Mike. I'm so sorry I wasn't here." Mike pulled back to look at his friend, his eyes filling with tears. "You cancelled shows, George? You never cancel shows." "Some things are more important than shows," George replied, and he meant it. "I saw the news report. I saw what happened to you, to all of this. I should have been here." "You couldn't have known," Mike said. But George shook his head. "I should have been paying attention. I should have been checking on you, on the town. I got so caught up in my own life that I forgot about the people who matter most." Mike introduced George to Martha Henderson, the woman he'd saved from the flood. She was recovering well, though she'd lost her home and most of her possessions. George spent time talking with her, learning about her life in Bandera, about the community that had been scattered by the disaster. As they talked, George began to understand the scope of what had happened. This wasn't just a flood that had damaged some buildings. This was a catastrophe that had destroyed a way of life, that had scattered families and erased decades of history. The Bandera that George remembered, the place that had shaped his character and his music, was gone. But what struck him most was the resilience of the people. Despite losing everything, they were taking care of each other. Mike had risked his life to save Martha, and now he was reading to her every day to help her cope with the trauma. Families who'd lost their homes were sharing their few remaining possessions with neighbors who'd lost even more. "What can I do?" George asked Mike as they walked outside the school that evening. "How can I help?" Mike looked at his friend, this man who'd become one of the most famous musicians in America, but was still at heart the same boy he'd grown up with in Bandera. "Just being here helps," Mike said. "People need to know they haven't been forgotten." But George knew that. Just being there wasn't enough. He had resources, connections, influence. He had the power to bring attention to Bandera's plight, to make sure these people got the help they needed. Most importantly, he had the ability to make sure that Mike Wilkins, the man who'd saved his neighbor's life while losing everything himself, wouldn't have to face the future alone. That night, George called Tom Bradley from his hotel room in Kerrville, the nearest town with functioning accommodations. "Tom, I need you to set up a benefit concert, the biggest one we can organize. I want every major country artist we can get, and I want it televised nationally." "George, are you sure about this? After canceling the tour, jumping right into a benefit might seem..." "Tom, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. These people need help, and I have the power to help them. What's the point of being George Strait if I can't use that to make a difference when it matters most?" As George lay in bed that night, he thought about the promise he and Mike had made to each other as boys, about always being there for each other when it mattered most. He'd failed that promise once, but he wouldn't fail it again. What happened next would determine whether Bandera would rise from the ashes or fade into memory, and George Strait was determined to make sure it was the former. The next morning, George was back at the high school before dawn, working alongside volunteers to distribute breakfast to the displaced families. Word had spread overnight that George Strait was in Bandera, and media trucks were beginning to arrive from San Antonio and Austin, But George wasn't interested in giving interviews or photo opportunities. He was focused on work, on understanding exactly what these people needed to rebuild their lives. "George, you don't have to do this," Mike said, watching his friend help an elderly man navigate the insurance paperwork that would determine whether he'd be able to rebuild his home. "You're a famous musician, not a disaster relief worker." "I'm a man from Bandera first," George replied, not looking up from the forms. "Everything else comes second." By noon, George had a clearer picture of the scope of the disaster and the inadequacy of the response. FEMA had promised aid, but it was moving slowly through bureaucratic channels. The Red Cross was doing what they could, but their resources were stretched thin across multiple disasters. Most frustrating of all, many of the families didn't have adequate insurance coverage to rebuild their homes. "It's going to take years," explained County Commissioner Helen Martinez when George met with local officials that afternoon. "Maybe decades. We're talking about rebuilding an entire town from scratch, and we simply don't have the resources." "What about state aid? Federal disaster relief?" George asked. Commissioner Martinez shook her head. "We're a small county, Mr. Strait. We don't have the political influence that bigger cities have. We've applied for everything we can think of. But the reality is that places like Bandera often get forgotten when it comes to disaster recovery." George felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the same anger he'd felt as a young man when he'd watched small towns across Texas struggle while politicians focused on bigger cities and more influential constituencies. But now he had something he hadn't had then, a platform that could reach millions of people. "What if we could get national attention?" George asked. "What if we could make sure Bandera doesn't get forgotten?" "That would be wonderful," Commissioner Martinez replied. "But I don't see how that's possible. The news cycle moves so fast these days. By next week, there will be another disaster, another tragedy for people to focus on." George left the meeting, more determined than ever. That evening he called Tom Bradley with specific instructions. "Tom, I need you to call everyone. I mean everyone. Keith Urban, Carrie Underwood, Blake Shelton, Miranda Lambert, Chris Stapleton, Casey Musgraves, every major country artist we can get. I want them all for a benefit concert in San Antonio next weekend." "George, that's impossible. These people have their own schedules, their own commitments. You can't organize something like that in a week." "Tom, I'm not asking them to do me a favor. I'm asking them to help save a community. If they can't understand that, then they're not the people I thought they were." Tom's voice softened. "George, I understand what you're trying to do, but even if we could get the artists, we need a venue, production equipment, television coverage. The logistics alone would take months to organize." "Then we'll do it simply. One stage, basic, sound system, and every major network in the country covering it. Tom, I've never asked you for anything like this before. I'm asking now." There was a long pause before Tom responded. "I'll start making calls." While Tom worked on organizing the benefit concert, George spent his days in Bandera, and what he saw there began to change him in ways he hadn't expected. He watched Mike Wilkins, who'd lost his home and nearly his life, spend his days helping other flood victims fill out insurance forms and apply for government assistance. He saw families who'd lost everything sharing their few remaining possessions, with neighbors who'd lost even more. But he also saw the frustration and despair that came with bureaucratic indifference. Families were being told that their flood damage wasn't covered by their insurance, because it was caused by rising water rather than storm damage. Elderly residents were being informed that their applications for disaster relief could take 6 months to process. Young families were leaving Bandera entirely, unable to afford the cost of rebuilding. "We're losing the town," Reverend Jackson told George one evening as they sat on the steps of the damaged church. "Not just the buildings, but the people. If we can't help them rebuild quickly, they'll go somewhere else, and Bandera will become a ghost town." That night, George sat in his hotel room with his guitar, something he hadn't done in months. Usually when he wrote songs, he was in a studio or his home music room, surrounded by professional equipment and the trappings of his success. But tonight, he was alone with just his guitar and the emotions that had been building inside him since he'd arrived in Bandera. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush that surprised him. He was writing about loss and resilience, about communities coming together in times of crisis, about the difference between having everything and having what matters most. The chorus came to him like a revelation. When rivers rise and take it all away, that's when we find out what we're made of today. By morning, George had written the most personal song of his career. When Rivers Rise was about Mike Wilkins, and Martha Henderson, about the volunteers at the high school and the families sleeping on Red Cross cots. But it was also about himself, about a man who'd found success and fame but had almost forgotten the values that had made him who he was. The response to Tom Bradley's calls was overwhelming. One by one, the biggest names in country music committed to the benefit concert. Keith Urban was flying in from Australia, where he was on tour. Carrie Underwood was rearranging her schedule to attend. Miranda Lambert was bringing her entire band, but it was Brad Paisley's response that moved George the most. "Tell George he doesn't even need to ask," Brad had told Tom. "When one of us is hurting, we all hurt. We'll be there." The benefit concert was scheduled for the Alamodome in San Antonio, with a capacity of over 60,000. Tickets went on sale on Wednesday morning and sold out in 47 minutes. The event was being broadcast live on CMT, CBS, and streaming online, with the potential to reach over 50 million viewers. But even as the concert came together, George knew it was just the beginning. The real work would come after the cameras stopped rolling, after the last song was sung and the last check was written. Rebuilding Bandera would take years, and it would require sustained attention and commitment. That's when George made a decision that surprised even himself. He called a press conference for Friday morning, the day before the benefit concert. Media from across the country gathered at the Alamodome, expecting to hear about the concert and the fundraising efforts. Instead, George Strait made an announcement that would change his life forever. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for coming today and for the attention you're giving to the situation in Bandera and the other communities affected by the floods. Tomorrow night's concert is going to raise a lot of money, and that money will help a lot of families rebuild their homes and their lives. But money alone isn't enough. These communities need sustained attention, sustained support, and sustained commitment. They need to know that when the news cameras leave and the headlines fade, someone is still fighting for them. So today, I'm announcing the creation of the Texas Flood Relief Foundation, a permanent organization dedicated to helping communities recover from natural disasters. We're going to be there for the long haul, not just when it's convenient or when it makes for good television. The reporters were scribbling notes furiously, but George wasn't finished. "I'm also announcing that I'm taking a year off from touring to focus on this work. I've spent 40 years traveling the country, singing songs and entertaining people. Now I want to spend time rebuilding the place that made me who I am." The room erupted in questions, but George held up his hand for silence. "I know what you're thinking. George Strait doesn't cancel tours. George Strait doesn't take time off. George Strait is reliable, consistent, professional. And you're right. I've built my career on being those things. But I've learned something in the past week that I should have learned a long time ago. Success isn't about how many records you sell or how many awards you win. Success is about being there for the people who matter when they need you most. I failed at that once. I won't fail again." As George left the press conference, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The benefit concert the next night was everything Tom Bradley had promised and more. 60,000 people filled the Alamodome, and millions more watched on television and online. One by one, the biggest names in country music took the stage, each dedicating their performances to the flood victims. But it was George's performance that everyone would remember. He walked onto the stage alone, carrying just his guitar, and began to sing "When Rivers Rise." The arena fell silent as the first verse began, and by the time he reached the chorus, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. When rivers rise and take it all away, that's when we find out what we're made of. Today, when everything you've built comes tumbling down, that's when you learn what holds you to the ground. In the audience, Mike Wilkins sat in the front row, tears streaming down his face. Beside him, Martha Henderson held his hand, both of them, overwhelmed by the knowledge that their story, their pain, their resilience, had become a symbol of hope for millions of people. But the most powerful moment came at the end of the song, when George looked directly at Mike and sang the final verse. "I had a friend who showed me what it means to love your neighbor more than yourself. When the waters came to take his life away, he chose to save someone else." The applause was thunderous, but George wasn't finished. He set down his guitar and walked to the edge of the stage, speaking directly to the camera that would carry his words to millions of viewers. "Tonight, we've raised over $50 million for flood relief. That money will help rebuild homes and businesses and lives. But more importantly, we've shown that when disaster strikes, Americans don't abandon each other. We come together. We help each other. We rebuild together." He paused, looking out at the crowd, then back at the camera. The people of Bandera and all the other communities affected by these floods didn't just lose their homes. They lost their sense of security, their belief that tomorrow would be better than today. Our job isn't just to help them rebuild their houses. Our job is to help them rebuild their hope. As the concert ended and the final totals were announced, George Strait stood backstage, exhausted but exhilarated. He'd done something that night that he'd never done before. He'd used his fame not just to entertain, but to change lives, to give hope to people who'd lost everything. But as he looked out at the crowd filing out of the Alamodome, as he thought about the millions of people who'd watched the concert and opened their hearts and their wallets to help strangers in need, George knew that this was just the beginning. The real work would start tomorrow, when the cameras were gone and the headlines had faded, when it was time to keep the promises he'd made and prove that some things really were more important than fame and fortune. 1 year later, George Strait stood in the exact spot where Mike Wilkins' house had once been. But instead of an empty lot scarred by flood damage, he was looking at a beautiful new home with a wraparound porch and a garden that Martha Henderson had helped design. Mike was sitting on the front steps, looking healthier and happier than he had in years, watching his granddaughter play in the yard that had been underwater just 12 months before. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Mike said as George joined him on the porch. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago." George nodded, understanding exactly what his friend meant. The past year had been the most challenging and rewarding of his life. He'd kept his promise to take time off from touring, and instead had spent his days in Bandera and other flood-affected communities, working alongside volunteers, contractors, and local officials to rebuild not just homes, but lives. The Texas Flood Relief Foundation had grown beyond anything George had imagined. What had started as a response to the Bandera flood had become a permanent organization with offices in Austin, Houston, and San Antonio. They'd helped over 3,000 families rebuild their homes, assisted dozens of small businesses in reopening, and established emergency response protocols that had already proved invaluable when other disasters struck. "George, there's something I need to tell you," Mike said, his voice taking on a serious tone. "Something I've been meaning to say for months." George looked at his friend, concerned. "What is it, Mike?" "When I was in that water, when I thought I was going to die, I wasn't thinking about my house or my possessions or anything like that. I was thinking about the people I loved, the people who'd made my life worth living. And you know what? Your name was at the top of that list." Mike's eyes filled with tears, and George felt his own throat tighten. "I spent 40 years being proud of my friendship with George Strait, the country music star. But this past year, I've been proud of my friendship with George Strait, the man who came home when his friend needed him. The man who gave up a year of his career to help rebuild a town most people had never heard of." "Mike, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," Mike interrupted. "You saved this town, George. Not just with your money or your fame, but with your presence. You showed people that Bandera mattered, that we mattered, and you showed me that our friendship meant as much to you as it did to me." George stood up and walked to the porch railing, looking out at the town that had been reborn from the ashes of disaster. Main Street was bustling with activity again, though many of the businesses were new. The old diner had been rebuilt, bigger and more modern than before. The movie theater had reopened with digital projection and comfortable seating. New homes dotted the landscape, built to higher standards that would better withstand future floods. But it wasn't just the physical rebuilding that amazed George. It was the sense of community that had emerged from the tragedy. People who'd been strangers before the flood were now close friends. Neighbors who'd barely spoken to each other were now looking out for one another's children and elderly parents. The disaster had stripped away the superficial differences that had divided the community and revealed the shared values that bound them together. "Do you remember what we used to say when we were kids?" George asked, turning back to Mike. "That we'd always be there for each other no matter what?" Mike smiled. "I remember, and you know what? We kept that promise. It just took us 70 years to really understand what it meant." The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation. George turned to see a convoy of cars and trucks coming down the street, and he recognized the organized chaos. That meant the Foundation's disaster response team was arriving for another training exercise. Over the past year, Bandera had become the headquarters for the Foundation's operations, and the town had embraced its new role as a center for disaster, preparedness and recovery. "Looks like they're here for the drill," Mike said, standing up and brushing off his jeans. "You know, I never thought I'd say this, but I'm actually excited about it." George laughed. Mike had become one of the Foundation's most valuable volunteers, using his construction skills and his intimate knowledge of the local area to help train response teams. At 68 years old, he was busier and more energetic than he'd been in years. The training exercise was impressive to watch. Teams of volunteers practiced evacuating elderly residents, setting up emergency shelters, and coordinating with state and federal agencies. What had once been a chaotic and tragic response to an unexpected disaster was now a well-organized operation that could be deployed anywhere in Texas within hours. "Mr. Strait," called out Sarah Chen, the Foundation's executive director, as she approached with a clipboard in her hand. "We're ready for the dedication ceremony whenever you are." George nodded. Today was the day they'd all been working toward for months. The official opening of the Mike Wilkins Community Center, a state-of-the-art facility that would serve as both a community gathering place and an emergency shelter for future disasters. The ceremony was held in the center's main hall, with several hundred people in attendance. Local officials, Foundation volunteers, flood survivors, and media representatives filled the room. But George's attention was focused on the front row, where Mike sat with Martha Henderson, both of them looking overwhelmed by the honor. "When we first started planning this center," George said as he approached the podium, "we knew we wanted to name it after someone who represented the best of what Bandera means. Someone who put others before himself, who risked everything to help a neighbor, who showed us all what real courage looks like." He paused, looking directly at Mike. Mike Wilkins didn't just save Martha Henderson's life during the flood. He saved the soul of this community. He showed us that being a hero isn't about having superpowers or being famous. It's about making the choice to help others even when it costs you everything. The applause was thunderous, but George raised his hand for silence. This center isn't just a building, it's a promise that no one in Bandera will ever face disaster alone again, a promise that we'll always be there for each other no matter what. A promise that Mike Wilkins's legacy will live on in every life this center touches. As the ribbon was cut and the crowd toured the new facility, George found himself standing alone in the center's museum, which displayed artifacts from the flood and told the story of the community's recovery. There was a photo of Mike and Martha being rescued from the oak tree, another of George performing at the benefit concert, and dozens of images showing the rebuilding process. But the display that moved George the most was a simple glass case containing a water-damaged book, the same book that Mike had been reading to Martha in the emergency shelter. The placard next to it read, "Donated by Mike Wilkins in memory of all those who helped others during the flood of 2024. It's quite a story, isn't it? George turned to find Reverend Jackson standing behind him, looking at the same display. "It is," George agreed, "and it's not over yet." "No, it's not. But you know what strikes me most about this whole experience? It's not the tragedy that defines us. It's how we respond to the tragedy. And this community responded with love, with generosity, with determination to build something better than what was lost." George nodded, thinking about his own response to the disaster. A year ago, he'd been George Strait, the country music star, focused on his career and his next tour. Now he was George Strait, the community activist, the disaster relief organizer, the friend who'd kept his promise. "Reverend, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think we would have been better people if the flood had never happened?" Reverend Jackson considered the question carefully. "I think we would have been the same people. Good people, caring people, but maybe not as aware of how much we needed each other. Sometimes it takes losing everything to realize what really matters." As the sun set over Bandera, George walked back to Mike's new house, where a barbecue was being held to celebrate the center's opening. The yard was filled with flood survivors, Foundation volunteers and local residents, all sharing food and stories and laughter. Mike was at the grill, flipping burgers and telling jokes, surrounded by his daughter Sarah and his grandchildren. Martha Henderson was sitting at a picnic table, teaching a group of children how to play cards. Everywhere George looked, he saw people who'd been strangers a year ago but were now family. "George," Mike called out, "get over here and help me with these burgers. You may be famous, but you're still not getting out of kitchen duty." George laughed and joined his friend at the grill. As they worked together, he thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The flood had taken so much from so many people, but it had also given them something precious, the knowledge that they could survive anything as long as they had each other. "You know what the best part of this whole year has been?" George asked, as they watched the sun disappear behind the Texas hills. "What's that?" "Remembering who I am, not George Strait the performer, but George Strait the friend, the neighbor, the man from Bandera. The flood didn't just wash away houses and businesses, it washed away all the things that don't really matter and left behind the things that do." Mike smiled and put his arm around his friend's shoulder. "Well, it's about time you figured that out. I've been trying to tell you that for 40 years. As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, George stood on Mike's porch, one last time, looking out at the town that had been destroyed and reborn. Tomorrow he would return to his music career, but he would never again forget the lessons he'd learned in Bandera. He would never again take for granted the people who'd known him before the fame, who'd loved him not for what he'd accomplished, but for who he was. The Mike Wilkins Community Center stood at the heart of the town, its lights shining like a beacon of hope. Inside, the walls were covered with photos of the flood and the recovery, reminders of both the worst and best of human nature. But the most important reminder was the inscription above the main entrance, words that George had written himself. "When rivers rise and take it all away, that's when we find out what we're made of today." Bandera had found out what it was made of, and so had George Strait. They were made of love, of loyalty, of the unbreakable bonds that tie communities together. They were made of the courage to help others even when it costs everything, and the wisdom to know that some things are more important than fame or fortune. The flood had taken everything from Bandera, but the people of Bandera had given it back something even more valuable: the knowledge that home isn't just a place on a map, but a community of people who care for each other, who show up when it matters most, who prove every day that even the strongest rivers can't wash away the things that really matter. And Mike Wilkins, the carpenter who'd risked his life to save his neighbor, had become the symbol of that truth, his legacy living on in every life touched by the community center that bore his name, in every disaster victim helped by the foundation. His heroism had inspired, and in the renewed friendship between two boys from Bandera who'd grown up to discover that the most important promises are the ones we make to each other.